Hollywood's rebel protest, rejecting the Oscar. When the stage lights blazed and the envelope opened, everyone in the room knew they would hear Marlon Brando's name. The role of Don Vito Corleone was a masterpiece, and the Oscar was practically guaranteed, but no one was prepared for the drama about to unfold on the Oscar stage that evening. When not Brando, but a woman with long black hair and traditional leather-fringed clothing stepped onto the stage, the room was stunned. Marlon Brando has asked me to tell you that he cannot accept this award. Sakine Littlefeather's words were met with boos before she could finish. That night, Hollywood's golden age came to an end, and nothing was ever the same again. Make sure to watch this story to the very end because the real reason behind Brando's decision is far darker and more personal than you've been told. And if you enjoy content like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel because in upcoming videos we'll be exposing Hollywood's most closely guarded scandals one by one. On the evening of March 27, 1973, the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in Los Angeles was magnificently illuminated, and Hollywood's brightest stars were walking the red carpet. The 45th Academy Awards ceremony was set to go down in history as the greatest celebration in the film world, but no one could have predicted that the evening would actually transform into a revolutionary moment. The directors, producers, and actors sitting in the auditorium were part of a dream scene in their tuxedos and dazzling gowns. Francis Ford Coppola was proud that The Godfather had been nominated in 8 categories and was almost certain that Marlon Brando would win the Best Actor award. Brando hadn't just played a role as Don Vito Corleone, he had brought a legend to life, and this performance was already being hailed as one of the most iconic acts in cinema history. However, Marlon Brando was not at the ceremony that night, and no one found this strange. Brando was known for his distant stance toward Hollywood's traditional ceremonies. More than a decade earlier, when he won the Oscar for On the Waterfront, he hadn't attended the ceremony either, and his sister Jocelyn had accepted the award on his behalf. For Brando, these awards were nothing more than candy that Hollywood gave itself, and he didn't want to be part of this game. But this time, there were far deeper and more complex reasons behind his absence from the ceremony. Brando had a plan in mind, and this plan carried the seeds of a moment that would be etched into Hollywood's history. As the ceremony progressed, categories were announced one by one. Gene Hackman, Joel Grey, Liza Minnelli, winners took the stage, gave tearful acceptance speeches, and pressed golden statuettes to their chests. As the clock approached 10, the most important category of the evening arrived, Best Actor. Among the nominees were giants like Michael Caine, Laurence Olivier, Peter O'Toole, and Paul Winfield, but everyone knew this award would go to Marlon Brando. When Liv Ullmann and Roger Moore stepped onto the stage, the tension in the room became palpable. The envelope was opened, and the expected name was read, Marlon Brando, The Godfather. Applause erupted, but Brando's seat was empty. Then something strange happened. Liv Ullmann and Roger Moore, waiting on stage, looked at each other and gestured toward the wings. The cameras in the room focused on a figure descending the stairs. At first, it wasn't clear who this person was, but as they approached the stage, everyone was astonished. This was not Marlon Brando. The person who stepped onto the stage was a 26-year-old woman with long black hair, wearing traditional Apache clothing, with a leather-fringed vest, an embroidered skirt, and a beaded band tied around her forehead. She was a complete vision. Sakine Littlefeather had a serious and determined expression on her face as she walked toward the microphone. The applause in the room slowed, and a curious silence descended. Who was this woman, and why was she on stage instead of Marlon Brando? Sakine Littlefeather approached the microphone, gently pushed back the Oscar statuette that Roger Moore extended to her, and began to speak. Her voice was calm but determined. Hello, my name is Sakine Littlefeather. I'm Apache, and I'm president of the National Native American Affirmative Image Committee. I'm representing Marlon Brando this evening, and he has asked me to tell you that he very regretfully cannot accept this very generous award. A murmur went through the room. People were looking at each other. What was happening? Sakine continued. And the reasons for this being are the treatment of American Indians today by the film industry, and on television in movie reruns, and also with recent happenings at Wounded Knee. Before her words could be completed, some people in the room began to boo. But Sakine Littlefeather didn't stop. She continued her speech with determination. At that very moment, television cameras began capturing the reactions of celebrities in the room. Some were applauding, some were sitting in astonishment, and others looked openly uncomfortable. Clint Eastwood had furrowed his brow, while Michael Caine sat with a mocking smile. These reactions showed how divided Hollywood was about Brando's move. Sakine Littlefeather completed her speech without looking at the paper in her hand, and left the stage. The entire event had lasted only 1 minute, but it had become a turning point in Hollywood history. Marlon Brando had rejected the most prestigious acting award in history, and in doing so, he had sent a message to the entire world. Art is not separate from politics, and remaining silent is complicity in crime. But the real story behind this decision was far more complex than what was said on stage that night. So how did Marlon Brando come to make this radical move? And more importantly, was Sachin Littlefeather really who she claimed to be? Because documents that would emerge years later would show that the real story of that night was completely different. Marlon Brando's interest in Native American rights actually dated back much further. In the early 1960s, Brando had begun to feel uncomfortable with Hollywood's constant portrayal of Native Americans as savage, primitive, or comical characters. He himself had seen Native American characters caricatured by white actors in dozens of Western films, and this situation had deeply affected him. In 1964, Brando joined the Puyallup tribe protesting for fishing rights in Washington state, and was even arrested. This was the first time a Hollywood star had gone so far to defend the rights of Native Americans, and it caused a major stir in the media. Brando's activism wasn't just for show. He was a person who could risk everything for causes he truly believed in. In the late 1960s, Brando supported the occupation of Alcatraz Island by Native Americans and went to the island to bring food and supplies to the protesters. Far from Hollywood's glittering world, Brando had completely dedicated himself to this cause. But the media didn't care much about this. Newspapers preferred to talk about his private life rather than his political activities. Brando was developing a growing anger toward Hollywood's hypocrisy. On one hand, they were making millions by portraying Native Americans as savages, and on the other hand, real Native American activists were being silenced as they sought their rights. In early 1973, a historic event occurred in the village of Wounded Knee, South Dakota. Militants from the American Indian movement occupied the town of Wounded Knee to protest corruption in the Pine Ridge Reservation and injustices committed against Native Americans by the federal government. This place was not chosen by chance. Wounded Knee was the site where in 1890 the United States Army massacred nearly 300 Lakota Native Americans. Now, 83 years later, Native activists had raised their flag in the same place. Federal agents surrounded the village and tensions rapidly escalated. Gunfire was heard and 2 Native American activists were killed. The media was partially following the event, but Hollywood was silent. Marlon Brando was determined to break this silence. As the Oscar ceremony approached, Brando was already confident he would win the award for The Godfather. Francis Ford Coppola and producer Albert Ruddy insisted that Brando attend the ceremony, but Brando had clearly refused. He went even further. He said that if he won the award, he would not accept it, and instead a Native American would take the stage and make a statement. Coppola was surprised, but he knew Brando. It was impossible to dissuade him from this decision. Brando was determined to use this opportunity to bring the events at Wounded Knee to the world's agenda. But finding the person to take the stage wasn't easy. Marlon Brando first reached out to several Native American activists he knew, but most were reluctant to take on this task. Making such a statement in a conservative environment like the Oscar ceremony required great courage, and many people were afraid to take on this responsibility. Eventually, Brando found Sachin Littlefeather. Sachin was a young activist living in San Francisco at the time, working for Native American rights. She said she came from Apache and Yaqui roots and was actively working with the National Native American Affirmative Image Committee. Brando met with her and explained his plan. Sachin hesitated at first, but then agreed. This would be the biggest moment of her life. Before Oscar night arrived, Brando and Sachin prepared a speech text together. Brando knew exactly what needed to be said. The speech text included the events at Wounded Knee, the injustices Hollywood had done to Native Americans, and the media's hypocrisy on these issues. The text was exactly 15 pages long, and it would take Sachin about 5 minutes to read it. But there was a problem here. Acceptance speeches at the Oscar ceremony were only given 60 seconds. Brando knew this but didn't care. His plan was for Sachin to take the stage and say as much as possible. If they cut her microphone, that would be even better, because censorship itself would also be a message. When Sachin Littlefeather arrived at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion a few hours before the ceremony, security guards tried to stop her. She had worried she wouldn't be allowed in because of her traditional clothing, but Brando's assistant intervened and said Sachin was registered as a guest. When Sachin entered, her heart was racing. Among all those celebrities, tuxedos and dazzling dresses, she felt completely foreign, but she had only one thing on her mind: raising her voice for her brothers and sisters at Wounded Knee. Sachin waited backstage before the ceremony and anticipated Marlon Brando's name being called. When the clock approached 10, her heart was beating so fast she had trouble breathing. When the Best Actor category was announced and Marlon Brando's name was read, Sachin took a deep breath and began walking toward the stage. Her legs were trembling, but her face showed a determined expression. As she climbed the stairs, she could feel thousands of eyes in the room watching her. When the television cameras focused on her, millions of people around the world saw this young Native American woman on their screens and tried to understand what was happening. When Sachin reached the stage, Roger Moore extended the Oscar statuette to her, but Sachin raised her hand and gently pushed it back. This gesture was symbolic. She was refusing Hollywood's gift. When Sachin began to speak, her voice trembled at first, but then grew stronger. She knew there wouldn't be enough time to read the 15-page speech, so she tried to emphasize the most important points. She said that Marlon Brando could not accept this award because of the injustices done to Native Americans.
She mentioned Wounded Knee. She talked about how the film industry caricatured Native Americans. Her speech lasted only 60 seconds, but that time was enough. The message had been delivered. While some in the room applauded, others booed. As Sachin left the microphone and descended from the stage, her knees were buckling, but she had succeeded. She had completed her mission. But the real shock of the night happened after Sachin left the stage. The first person to greet her backstage was actor John Wayne, famous for his Western films, and he was furious with rage. Wayne was known for his conservative views, and defending Native American rights was unacceptable to him. Sachin, in interviews she gave years later, described that moment as follows: "John Wayne came at me backstage. 6 security guards had to hold him back. He was yelling at me, insulting me. He said he wanted to drag me off the stage and throw me out." This scene showed how divided Hollywood was. On one side were activist artists like Brando, on the other side were conservative stars like John Wayne, and the chasm between these two groups had fully emerged that night. When Sachin Littlefeather left the ceremony, she didn't feel safe. The next day, newspapers ran the event in their headlines, and reactions were divided. Some newspapers found Brando and Sachin brave and inspiring, while others characterized them as disrespectful and uncouth. The New York Times described the event as the most controversial moment in Oscar history. The Hollywood Reporter interpreted Brando's move as career suicide, but Brando didn't care. He had delivered his message and was ready to pay any price for it. Behind Brando's decision were not only his political beliefs but also much more personal reasons. Brando had shown great resistance to authority figures since childhood. His father was an alcoholic and violent man, and Brando carried this trauma throughout his life. Hollywood's authoritarian structure reminded him of his father. The way the studio system treated actors like commodities, tried to control them, and wanted to silence their voices drove Brando crazy. Rejecting the Oscar was not just a protest for Native American rights, it was also a rebellion against Hollywood's entire system, against the bosses, studio executives, and this hypocritical industry. In the days following Brando's Oscar rejection, a major debate began in the media. Some commentators said that Brando had politicized art with this move and ruined the sacred atmosphere of the Oscar ceremony. Famous critic Rex Reed said, "Marlon Brando held hostage a ceremony watched by millions of people to satisfy his own ego." However, on the other hand, many activists, journalists, and artists supported Brando. Writer James Baldwin wrote, "Brando did what Hollywood would never do. He told the truth." The activists at Wounded Knee gained much more visibility in the media after Brando's move, and their cause took center stage on the world's agenda. But Hollywood didn't forgive Brando. After rejecting the Oscar, Brando's career opportunities significantly decreased. Studios were no longer offering him big-budget projects like they used to. Producers thought Brando was a difficult actor and could get them into trouble. Brando appeared in a few films in the following years, but none achieved the success of The Godfather. Some said Brando's career ended with his Oscar rejection. But for Brando, this didn't matter. He was at peace with his conscience and never regretted what he had done. Brando, in interviews he gave in his later years, often mentioned Oscar night and said he never regretted that decision. In an interview he gave in 1974, he said, "Whether they gave me the Oscar or not didn't matter to me. But I could use that stage to amplify the voices of the people at Wounded Knee, and I did. If I were in the same situation again, I would do the same thing." For Brando, art and politics were inseparable. An artist's duty was not just to entertain the audience, but also to awaken society's conscience. However, the story of Oscar night came back to the agenda in an unexpected way years later. In 2022, shortly before Sachin Littlefeather's death, the San Francisco Chronicle published an investigative article and made shocking claims about Sachin's true identity. According to the newspaper, Sachin Littlefeather's real name was Maria Louise Cruz, and she was not of Apache or Yaqui descent. According to documents, her family was a white family of Mexican origin, and there was no evidence that Sachin was Native American. These claims created a major controversy. Some said Sachin was a fraud, while others argued that these claims were only put forward to harm her. Sachin Littlefeather denied these claims throughout her life and always maintained her Apache identity. However, her siblings and some family members confirmed the San Francisco Chronicle's claims and said Sachin was not Native American. Did this situation change the meaning of that Oscar night? For some, yes. If Sachin really wasn't Native American, then the legitimacy of her taking the stage that night became debatable. But on the other hand, the message itself was still valid. The events at Wounded Knee were real, Hollywood's injustices toward Native Americans were real, and Brando's protest had revealed these truths. Marlon Brando died in 2004 without being aware of the controversies about Sachin's identity. After Brando's death, his friends and family continued to defend his decision on Oscar night. Brando's son Miko Brando said in an interview, "My father did the right thing that night. Who Sachin was doesn't matter. What matters is that the message was delivered, and it was. Wounded Knee was not forgotten, and my father risked everything for that." This statement summarized Brando's character. He was someone who fought for what he believed in without thinking about the consequences. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences remained silent for years about the protest Brando made that night. However, in 2022, a few months before Sachin Littlefeather's death, the Academy issued an official apology. Academy President David Rubin wrote the following in a letter sent to Sakine. We sincerely apologize for the harm your experience at the Oscars caused you and your community. The treatment you received at that night was unacceptable and indefensible. Even if it is late, we want to acknowledge this. This apology showed that Hollywood was still trying to heal the wounds of that night 50 years later. But even while accepting the apology, Sakine Littlefeather continued her criticism. In an interview she gave in 2022, she said, "It's good that they apologize, but it's not enough. Hollywood's perspective on Native Americans still hasn't changed. They're still using the same stereotypes. Native characters are still being played by white actors, and Native directors aren't being given opportunities. Apologizing is easy, but I want to see real change." These words were the same as what Brando tried to say 50 years earlier. Hollywood's problem wasn't just an event left in the past, it was still an ongoing systemic issue. The long-term effects of Marlon Brando's decision to reject the Oscar were not limited to Hollywood. That night, millions of people around the world heard about Wounded Knee for the first time. The media focused more on Native American rights and the situation in the Pine Ridge Reservation. Some historians say that Brando's move played an important role in the momentum gained by Native American rights movements in the 1970s. Of course, a single Oscar rejection couldn't change the world, but it had been a powerful tool for drawing attention. Brando had used his fame as a weapon and hit his target right on the mark. Marlon Brando wasn't the only person to reject an Oscar, but he was the one who did it most dramatically. In 1971, writer George C. Scott had rejected his Best Actor Oscar for the film Patton, but he had protested quietly by not attending the ceremony. Brando, on the contrary, had used the ceremony as a platform and delivered his message to all corners of the world. This strategy inspired other celebrities in subsequent years to voice their political messages on large platforms like the Oscar stage. In 2003, Michael Moore protested the Iraq War. In 2016, Leonardo DiCaprio talked about climate change. Many artists passed through the door Brando opened and saw the Oscar stage not just as an awards ceremony but also as an activism platform. However, the tragedies in Brando's private life remained in the shadow of this brave stance in his career. Years after he rejected the Oscar, in 1990, his son Christian Brando killed his sister Cheyenne's boyfriend, and the Brando family exploded into the media's agenda like a bomb. During the trial, Brando took the stand to defend his son and tearfully confessed to being a bad father. This moment deeply shook Brando's public image. The rebel man who once challenged Hollywood was now appearing before them as a broken father. The media was talking not about Brando's political courage but about his familial failures, and perhaps this was a much heavier blow for Brando than rejecting the Oscar. Marlon Brando's final years were spent in isolation and illness. He reached a weight exceeding 350 pounds and almost never left his house. Friends said Brando had fallen into depression and lost his interest in life. But he never regretted Oscar night. On the contrary, he continued to defend that decision until the end of his life. For Brando, what mattered was not how he would go down in history but doing the right thing. And he had done the right thing. When Marlon Brando died in 2004, the whole world came together to remember him. Newspapers wrote pages about him. Special programs aired on television, and Hollywood declared it had lost a legend. But at the funeral, at Brando's request, very few people were present. Brando wanted to stay away from show and fakery, even after his death. Part of his ashes were scattered on his island in Tahiti after his death, and some were given to his closest friends. Brando died as he lived, by his own rules. On the 51st anniversary of the Oscar ceremony, in 2024, Hollywood still hasn't found another star who could make the move Marlon Brando made that night. Celebrities still give political messages, still protest, but none have reached Brando's level of courage. Because Brando didn't just deliver a message, he threw away the Oscar, Hollywood's most sacred symbol, as if it were nothing. This was an unprecedented act in Hollywood history, and probably won't be seen again. Today, the younger generation knows Marlon Brando mainly for his role as Don Vito Corleone in The Godfather. But that Oscar night was the moment that truly revealed who Brando was. He wasn't just an actor. He was an activist, a rebel, a conscience. Even if Hollywood didn't forgive him, history vindicated him. Because Brando spoke where everyone was silent. He rebelled where everyone bowed down. And in a system where everyone applauded, he questioned that system. Marlon Brando's rejection of the Oscar wasn't just a dramatic moment at an awards ceremony. This was a statement that a man's conscience was more important than his career, fame, and money. Brando told Hollywood that night, "I will not play your game. I will live by my own rules. And if this bothers you, the problem is not with me, it's with you." That's why Marlon Brando is not just a cinema legend, but also a source of inspiration. Because he taught us that doing the right thing is not always easy, but always necessary. And perhaps the most important lesson was this: even when the stage lights go out, the light of conscience never goes out. Marlon Brando lost an Oscar that night, but gained eternal respect. Hollywood punished him, but history rewarded him, because courage is more valuable than any golden statuette can ever be. And Marlon Brando, for showing that courage, went down in history not just as an actor, but also as a human being. How many people remember Wounded Knee today is unknown, but everyone who follows cinema history knows that moment when Marlon Brando rejected the Oscar. And that was perhaps the greatest achievement, reminding people of what was forgotten, showing what was ignored, and giving voice to those whose voices were unheard. Marlon Brando achieved this success, and for that he deserved much more than an Oscar.